He was just scraping old paint off the wall, preparing the house for renovation. But under the layers of plaster, he found a secret entrance that had been hidden from view for decades. What the painter saw behind the door prompted him to call the police immediately. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you are from. Daniel Clark had been painting other people's houses for more than 20 years, and in all that time, he had thought he had seen every kind of job there was. He had worked on shiny new suburban homes where the owners wanted the walls to match the latest design trend, on aging farmhouses whose cracked clapboards flaked into his hands, on city apartments with ceilings so low he had to crouch to roll a coat of primer. Work was work, and Daniel took quiet pride in doing it well. But nothing in those 2 decades prepared him for the house that stood waiting at the end of the long, tree-lined drive on the day he arrived with his brushes and ladders. It rose out of the overgrown property like a gray sentinel, massive and unmoving, its stone facade streaked with age and weather. Ivy clung to every surface, twisting into the cracks of carved lintels and crawling up the tall chimneys. A set of iron gates, twisted on their hinges and mottled with rust, marked the entrance to the estate. The driveway beyond them was lined with weeds that had pushed through the cobblestones, their wiry stalks whispering in the faint morning breeze. Daniel parked his van just outside, turned off the engine, and sat for a long moment, staring at the place. He had been told it was old, but he hadn't expected it to look resistant. The air smelled of damp earth and something faintly metallic, like rain on old pipes. Somewhere beyond the gates, a crow gave a sharp cry, and the sound seemed to echo longer than it should have. He rubbed his palms on his worn jeans and reminded himself why he was here. The new owner, some wealthy investor who had recently bought the property at auction, wanted to bring the house back to life. Daniel had been hired for the first step, scraping away the peeling layers of paint and repairing damaged walls so fresh color could be applied later. The pay was good, better than he usually got for interior prep work, and the job would last weeks. That mattered. His rent was late, his truck payment overdue. He needed this. He climbed out, hauled open the gates with a groan of protesting iron, and drove up the cracked driveway. As the van bounced over uneven stones, he felt a strange tug in his chest. He told himself it was just the size of the job, but the feeling didn't fade when he parked and stepped out. Up close, the house loomed even larger, its high windows dark and blank, some shuttered, others broken. Stone steps led to a grand entrance, flanked by columns that had once been elegant, but now were chipped and stained. He could picture the house in its glory, polished brass door handles, lanterns glowing at dusk, a sweeping garden full of trimmed hedges and rose beds. Now the lanterns were black with rust, and the garden was a jungle of tangled vines and collapsed trellises. Inside, the air changed. It was cooler than outside, heavy with dust and the faint scent of mold. Daniel set down his tool bag and took in the vast foyer. A staircase curved upward toward the second floor, its banister wrapped in a fine web of cobwebs. The floors were a patchwork of cracked marble tiles and warped wood. Large rooms branched off on either side, a parlor with its fireplace choked by fallen plaster, a dining room where a chandelier hung crookedly, crystals dulled by grime. Everywhere he looked, he saw evidence of wealth gone to ruin. He started his day the way he always did, practical and methodical. From his bag, he pulled out his scraper, a flashlight, and rolls of plastic sheeting to protect the floors. He moved to one of the long walls in the foyer and began to work. Each stroke of the scraper sent a cascade of paint chips fluttering to the ground. Layers came away in colors that told a story of decades. Dull beige over faded green, over yellowed cream, over something that might once have been fashionable blue. Occasionally his blade caught on an older, brittle seam and lifted an entire sheet of paint and plaster in a satisfying peel. Beneath it, he sometimes found wallpaper patterns from forgotten eras, delicate flowers, geometric stripes, even one section with tiny airplanes marching across a sky of pale blue. He worked steadily, losing himself in the rhythm of scraping and brushing, bagging debris and uncovering the raw surface beneath. But as the hours passed, the house began to weigh on him in ways he couldn't define. It wasn't just the silence. He had worked in empty buildings before. This was heavier, a quiet that seemed to have intent, as though the house had been waiting a long time and resented his intrusion. The creak of the old floorboards under his boots felt amplified. The rasp of his scraper echoed back from corners too deep in shadow. More than once he caught himself glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see someone watching. The air moved strangely, too, a faint draft where there should be none, whispering along the baseboards. Late in the afternoon, he moved into a narrow hallway, leading to what must have been an old library. Here the walls were layered with particularly thick paint, the kind that had been redone so many times it had built up into uneven ridges. He set to work, scraping with long, deliberate strokes. The sound changed unexpectedly beneath his blade. Instead of the solid, slightly hollow rasp of plaster, there came a deeper, dull thud. Daniel paused. He tapped lightly with the handle of the scraper. The noise was wrong, hollow, but not the way a studded wall should be. It sounded as though something vast and empty lay just beyond. Curious, he scraped harder, clearing a patch about the size of his hand. Beneath the paint wasn't just plaster. It was a smoother, colder surface, metal gray, where he had expected chalky white. He frowned, leaning close. Metal? Embedded into the wall? He worked faster now, widening the cleared area until the shape became clearer. Lines appeared, straight and deliberate, forming the faint outline of a rectangle about the size of a door. His heart gave an odd jump. He stepped back, studying it. The edges had been expertly hidden under layers of plaster and paint, blended so well that no casual renovation would have revealed them. For a long minute he stood there, breathing quietly, dust clinging to his hair and shirt. He had found strange things before, forgotten safes, old wiring chases, but never anything like this. The outline was unmistakable. A door where no door should be, flush with the wall and sealed. At its center, just visible through the layers he had chipped away, was a metal plate, perhaps a locking mechanism, corroded with age but solid. No handle, no keyhole in the ordinary sense. Whoever had built this had meant it to stay closed. The light outside was fading. Daniel stepped back, wiped sweat from his forehead, and forced himself to think practically. It could be anything. A sealed utility access, an old dumbwaiter shaft, a forgotten storage space. But none of those things explained the craftsmanship with which it had been hidden, or the heavy metal he could feel beneath his fingertips when he touched the cold surface. A tremor of unease slid down his spine. He packed up his tools slowly, eyes drifting back to the hidden door, over and over. He told himself to focus on the job he had been hired for. Clean, prep, paint. Not investigate. But the secret he had uncovered clung to him like a burr. As he left the room and walked back through the dim foyer, he felt the house watching, silent and patient, as if it knew what he had found and was waiting to see what he would do next. Outside, twilight had deepened into a gray-blue dusk. Daniel locked the house behind him, loaded his gear into the van, and sat for a long moment before starting the engine. His hands rested on the steering wheel, but his thoughts were far away, back in that hallway, on the cold metal surface under layers of paint, The job had just changed. This was no longer about scraping and priming. It was about a question he could not ignore. What lay beyond that sealed door? And why had someone gone to such lengths to hide it? As he drove away down the weed-choked drive, the house shrank behind him into the gloom, but the unease did not fade. He felt it settle deeper, like the first stone dropped into a well. Tomorrow he would return to finish the work. And tomorrow, no matter how much he told himself to focus on paint and plaster, his eyes would go back to that hidden outline. Some part of him already knew that his life had shifted, subtly but irrevocably, the moment his scraper rang against metal. Sleep abandoned Daniel almost as soon as he lay down. The hidden door haunted him like a stubborn echo that refused to fade. He had returned home the evening before, coated in dust, his muscles sore from hours of scraping. Yet his exhaustion brought no rest. The shape of that sealed rectangle stayed behind his eyelids every time he closed them, cold and unyielding, as if the wall itself had imprinted on his mind. Each creak of his apartment building, each passing car on the street outside, reminded him of the hollow thud beneath his scraper. When he did drift off for a few minutes, he dreamed of colorless corridors stretching into darkness, of whispers behind plaster, of something waiting with infinite patience just beyond reach. He woke before dawn drenched in sweat, heart racing, though there had been no clear nightmare, only the sense of being observed. He tried to reason with himself while he made coffee in the pale light of early morning. People sealed things behind walls all the time. Builders abandoned shafts. Owners hid safes. Maybe there was nothing behind that door but empty space or outdated wiring. But he could not shake the deliberate quality of what he had uncovered. Someone had not just closed an access hatch, they had erased it. They had layered over it with meticulous patience until the wall told no tale. He felt, absurdly, that by scraping it open, he had broken a long truce the house kept with the world. By the time he drove back through the quiet streets toward the estate, a grim determination had replaced the unease. He told himself it was simple curiosity, but deep down, he knew it was more than that. Something about that house felt alive now that he had uncovered one of its secrets. If he ignored it, if he painted over that outline and walked away, it would not let him go. He would think of it for years. Better to know than to live with gnawing speculation. The sky was the same washed gray as the day before, heavy clouds pressing low over the town. His van rattled up the weed-choked drive once more, and the iron gates groaned as he forced them open. The house looked unchanged, still brooding, still draped in ivy and silence. But he felt different as he stepped out with his tools. The job was no longer ordinary. Every sound seemed sharper. Gravel underfoot, the squeal of the old door hinges as he entered, the hollow echo of his boots on marble. Inside, the air was cool and still. Dust motes drifted like lazy stars in the pale light slanting through cracked windows. Daniel carried his gear to the hallway where the door waited. Even through the gloom, the scraped patch of bare metal stood out like a wound. He set down his bag, wiped his palms on his pants, and studied it again. The outline was clear now, a perfect rectangle disguised for decades beneath paint and plaster. In the dim light, it looked almost like a shadow of another room. He worked methodically at first, expanding the area he had cleared until no trace of paint or wallpaper remained. The metal beneath was cold and unyielding, its surface faintly pitted with rust. He ran his fingertips along its edges, feeling how seamlessly it met the surrounding wall. Whoever had built this had not wanted it discovered. As he brushed away the last dust, his eyes caught on something he had missed before, a narrow seam at the top corner where the plaster had cracked just slightly over time. And just below the seam, hidden behind an old piece of molding, a small protrusion of metal no bigger than a switch. His pulse quickened. It was probably nothing, an anchor for some long-gone fixture, maybe. But the shape was strange. Tentatively, he pried the molding away with the edge of his scraper. Behind it lay a small, recessed lever, dark with age, nearly invisible unless you were looking for it. Daniel stared at it for a long moment, the air suddenly thick around him. Then, before he could talk himself out of it, he hooked 2 fingers under the cold metal and pulled. A click broke the silence, loud as a gunshot. He froze, breath shallow. For an instant, nothing happened. Then a faint mechanical groan came from deep inside the wall, a slow release of something that had been locked for decades. Dust sifted down from the ceiling. The metal plate trembled almost imperceptibly. He stepped back, heart pounding, as a thin line of shadow appeared where before there had been only seamless wall. The smell reached him first, dry, ancient dust, mixed with the damp tang of old metal, and something else, mildew perhaps, or earth long cut off from air. Daniel pressed his palm to the surface and felt a gave, subtle but real. Slowly, cautiously, he pushed. The hidden door swung inward with surprising ease, scraping faintly against the floor as it opened just enough to reveal darkness beyond. A breath of cold air flowed out to meet him. It smelled of forgotten places, wet stone, rust, stale time. He hesitated on the threshold, peering into the black gap with his flashlight. The beam caught rough concrete walls and a narrow corridor stretching forward. No decoration, no finishing touches, just raw utility, as though whoever built it cared only about function and secrecy. Daniel's first step inside was tentative. The concrete floor was uneven under his boots, gritty with decades of dust. His light pierced only a few yards ahead before the dark swallowed it. Behind him, the faint square of daylight from the hallway already looked distant. Each step he took echoed strangely, the sound bouncing back at him from unseen turns. He swallowed, throat dry, but kept going. The air grew cooler with every foot of progress, and droplets of water plinked softly somewhere ahead. The corridor bent after a dozen paces, leading him into a space that took his breath for a moment. It was a room larger than he expected, hidden entirely within the heart of the house. White sheets, now gray with dust, draped over furniture shapes, tables, chairs, maybe a couch. He swept the beams slowly. Cabinets lined one wall, their handles tarnished. Against another, stacks of boxes sagged with age, some collapsed, spilling brittle papers across the floor. The air was heavy with the scent of mildew and old wood. He moved carefully among the shrouded shapes. Beneath the sheets lay heavy, old-fashioned furniture, a roll-top desk, a wardrobe, a low table where yellowed papers had fused into one lump. He lifted a corner of one sheet and coughed as a cloud of dust rose. Time had embalmed this place. It didn't feel abandoned like a forgotten attic. It felt hidden on purpose, then left behind in haste. There was no sign of recent life, no footprints in the thick dust. He felt as though he had broken into a sealed memory. On one table lay newspapers crumbling with age. The visible headlines spoke of a world decades gone. Missile tests, treaties on the brink of collapse, fear threaded into every article. He thumbed through one until it fell apart in his hands. Another table held folders warped with moisture, their labels illegible but typed on yellowing tabs. Everything about this place whispered Cold War paranoia, fear of something vast and uncontrollable. At the far end of the hidden wing, half hidden behind a tangle of sheet-covered crates, he found something that made him stop. A stairwell, its mouth gaping like a well. A narrow set of metal steps descended into darkness, the air rising from below colder and wetter than what he had breathed so far. He crouched at the top and shone his light downward. The beam fell on damp concrete, vanishing quickly into black. A faint drip echoed upward, slow and hollow. His stomach tightened. The idea of going deeper alone should have terrified him, and yet curiosity burned hotter. What had been worth such elaborate secrecy? Why a door in the wall, a hidden passage, rooms no blueprint would show, and now stairs disappearing further still? He tried to convince himself this was just another part of the estate, a service basement perhaps, but he knew that was a lie. This wasn't utility space. It was too carefully erased. Daniel sat for a long minute on the cold step, breathing the damp air, flashlight trembling slightly in his grip. The house above was silent as a tomb. No one knew he was here. No one expected him back until evening. His heart pounded with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Then, before his better judgment could pull him away, he set his boot on the first metal step. It rang faintly, a lonely chime, swallowed by the depths below. He gripped the railing and began to descend, each step carrying him further from the world of light and paint and simple work into a darkness that felt deliberate. The deeper he went, the more the air changed. It grew colder, denser, touched with the scent of rust and something faintly electric, like old machinery. Moisture slicked the handrail under his glove. The beam of his flashlight wavered across rough walls pitted with damp. Shadows clung to the corners of the stairwell, retreating only where the light struck them. Daniel's breath sounded too loud, and the echo of his boots on metal steps made him feel like an intruder in some cavernous secret. When he reached the bottom, the stairwell opened onto a landing and a new door. This one heavy steel, its paint blistered and peeling. Unlike the first, it was not fully shut. It hung slightly ajar, crooked on its hinges, as though forced open long ago. A smell drifted out from the gap. Old stone, wet earth, and something harder to place, a metallic tang that made the back of his throat ache. Daniel stood there, heart hammering, staring into that thin slice of black beyond the door. He was deep now, deep enough that he could no longer pretend this was part of an ordinary house, deep enough that turning back felt both safe and somehow impossible. He thought of the concealed outline upstairs, the deliberate ceiling, the forgotten rooms. He thought of how alone he was, a single man with a flashlight and a crowbar, standing at the edge of whatever history had been buried here. Slowly, almost against his own will, he reached out and pushed. The steel door gave way with a moan that reverberated down the unseen space beyond, a sound so heavy and drawn out, it felt like the house itself groaned awake. Cold, stale air rushed past him as the gap widened. He tightened his grip on the flashlight and stepped across the threshold, leaving behind the last trace of normal life as he knew it. The blackness swallowed him, and the secrets of the house, long buried and breathless, began to breathe again. The first breath Daniel took beyond the steel door felt like inhaling the weight of decades. The air was thicker here, damp and cool against his face, laced with the smell of rust and stale time. His flashlight beam trembled as he swept it across the space, and for a moment, his brain refused to understand what it saw. He had expected a small chamber, perhaps another corridor. Instead, the beam fell upon a cavernous room that stretched far beyond what he imagined could fit beneath the house. The ceiling disappeared into darkness, supported by thick concrete beams webbed with moisture stains. The silence was almost physical, heavy enough that his own breath seemed loud and intrusive. He stepped forward cautiously, his boots crunching on a layer of grit. Each movement disturbed clouds of fine dust that drifted lazily through the light. The first thing his beam touched was a long table positioned just inside the room. Its surface was covered with the remains of a meal that had once been ordinary and now felt ghostly. Plates with hardened scraps still clinging to them, cups tipped on their sides, utensils scattered as if dropped in haste. A single wooden chair lay overturned beside the table, and that small detail sent a shiver crawling up his arms. It wasn't the patient ruin of a space left to rot. It was the frozen echo of a moment interrupted. Whoever had been here had left suddenly, leaving everything mid-gesture. He turned slowly, illuminating the rest of the room, piece by piece. Bunk beds lined the walls in neat rows, their frames metal and streaked with rust. The mattresses were still in place, thin and yellowed with age, some with the imprint of where a body had once lain. Pillows were dented and gray. In one corner, a low bookshelf leaned crookedly, its warped spine still showing faded titles. Old adventure novels, engineering manuals, children's storybooks. Newspapers lay scattered on the floor, their edges curled and brittle, but still legible where the dust wasn't too thick. He crouched and picked one up carefully, brushing at the headline. The ink was faded, but not gone. It spoke of missile tests, foreign standoffs, treaties on the verge of collapse. Cold War panic, distilled in print. Daniel let the paper crumble from his hands and rose, scanning farther with his light. Against the far wall sat wooden crates stacked 3 high, their boards darkened by moisture and stamped with codes in black paint. Many of the markings were smeared or flaking, but enough remained to make him uneasy. Alphanumeric identifiers, stenciled warnings, symbols he couldn't fully decode, but felt instinctively were military. He approached slowly, each step loud in the cavernous silence. When he brushed at one crate with his gloved hand, a layer of grime came away to reveal sharp black letters in a language not his own, and a faded emblem that might once have been an eagle or a crest. He stepped back instinctively, heart knocking hard against his ribs. These were not boxes of food or spare furniture. This was something else, something meant to be hidden and kept secure. The beam of his light skated over to another section of the chamber and caught movement, not true motion, just the illusion of it when light grazed hanging fabric. He found himself staring at a small coat rack tipped in the corner. A child's sweater still hung there, threadbare but unmistakable in its size. Below it, on the dusty floor, lay a toy. A wooden car with chipped wheels, its paint faded to nothing. The sight pierced him more than the crates had. There had been children here, living in this underground refuge built beneath a mansion of stone and wealth. They had slept in those bunks, played with that toy, walked these damp floors, and then they had gone, or perhaps fled. He swept the light higher and froze when he saw words scratched deep into the concrete wall above the bunks. "We are waiting. Waiting is worse than death." The letters were crude, uneven, gouged by some desperate hand with a nail or a piece of metal. Daniel reached out without thinking and touched the grooves. The concrete was rough and cold beneath his fingertips, and for a moment, he felt almost as if he could sense the despair embedded there. Whoever had carved it had been trapped long enough to abandon hope, yet still tried to send a message into the future. He pulled his hand back quickly, unsettled by how alive the plea felt even after all these years. He turned away, forcing himself to keep moving, though every instinct begged him to retreat. His light swept to a door at the far side of the chamber, smaller than the one he had just entered, but still of heavy steel, its surface mottled with rust. Unlike the others, this one was shut tight. He approached slowly, the echo of his footsteps oddly muted now, as if the room itself were listening. He rested a hand against the door and felt a faint vibration. Maybe his imagination, maybe just the hum of silence pressing too hard. The handle moved easily when he tried it, and the hinges, though squealing, yielded without much resistance. A colder, sharper smell rushed out as he pulled it open. Metal, oil, and something acrid that stung his nose. His flashlight swept across the smaller room beyond, and his breath caught. More crates, but these were different metal rather than wood, smaller but heavier. Their surfaces stenciled with clear warnings: munitions, hazardous materials, keep away from heat. Some labels were in English, others in languages he couldn't read, but the message was clear enough. These weren't survival supplies. This was an arsenal. Daniel stood in the doorway, gripping the frame until his knuckles whitened. He was no expert, but anyone could see this was not the kind of thing meant to be forgotten. Weapons sat here, dormant for decades, but potentially lethal if disturbed, or if they ever found their way into the wrong hands. He imagined the family above, the wealthy patriarch he'd seen in faded newspapers and photographs, turning his basement into a private vault, while the world teetered on nuclear brink. Had this been a safeguard against enemies, or a stockpile for profit? The thought chilled him. He forced himself to step inside, careful not to touch anything he didn't understand. The floor was littered with damp cardboard and scraps of paper. Near the crates stood several filing cabinets, their drawers rusted half open. Papers had spilled out, yellowed and curling, but still legible in places. He knelt and picked one up with trembling hands. It was a letter dated from the mid-60s, typed on official-looking stationery, and addressed to the mansion's then-owner. The language was clipped and bureaucratic, but certain words leapt out like threats. Distribution, overseas clients, shipments, diverted. He read another, stamped and signed in a flourish that might have been real or forged, referencing government contracts, rerouted assets, offshore accounts. The pattern was unmistakable even without full context. The man who had built this place had been involved in something vast, and illegal arms deals perhaps, profiteering from the world's fear. Daniel's pulse thudded as he sifted through more. Some papers included diagrams and inventory lists that matched the markings on the crates. Others carried names he didn't know, code words, and bank notations. Among them, he found a black and white photograph tucked into a file. A man in a tailored suit standing proudly in the sunlit garden above, the house behind him still grand and whole. Beside him stood a woman and two small children, their faces lit with the polished confidence of wealth. The man held one child on his hip, the other clutched a toy car startlingly like the one now lying in dust at Daniel's feet. The picture was dated 1963. He stared at it for a long time, a pit opening in his chest. Those children had lived above, while beneath them sat weapons, enough to tear apart lives. They had played under chandeliers while their father traded in fear. He kept moving because stopping meant letting the unease swallow him. Another drawer revealed photographs of the owner, shaking hands with men in military uniforms, some smiling stiffly, others turning away from the camera as though secrecy were second nature. Crates like those behind Daniel appeared in the background of more than one shot. Other images showed ships, dockside warehouses, planes being loaded under cover of night. It was a hidden empire, and this basement was one of its silent outposts. The scale of what he had uncovered settled on him gradually, heavier with every document and photograph. He was a painter, a man who lived quietly, paid bills, fixed his own truck when he could. And yet here he was, standing in a secret weapons cache, tied to shadows of the Cold War, to networks of power that had once stretched across borders. He wasn't meant to see any of this. He was nobody. And yet he had stumbled onto something built to remain buried. Fear curled sharp in his gut, but alongside it came something else, something more complicated than curiosity now. Responsibility. He didn't know much about munitions, but he knew danger when he saw it. Some of these crates looked badly corroded. Time could turn stable materials volatile. A careless hand, a spark, and the whole place might become a bomb beneath the house. Worse was the thought of someone eventually buying the estate and discovering this too. Someone who might want what was here. The idea of weapons like these slipping quietly into the modern world made him feel sick. He sat for a long time on the edge of one of the bunks, the photograph of the smiling family heavy in his hand. The scratched words on the wall loomed nearby, almost glowing in his beam. We are waiting. Waiting is worse than death. He imagined a family huddled here, children playing under the glow of a single bulb, while above the world threatened annihilation. He imagined panic, betrayal, maybe an attempt to escape that ended abruptly. He didn't know what had happened to them, death, flight, exposure, but he could feel the echo of their fear pressing against him. Leaving now would be simple. He could cover the door again, say nothing, take his paycheck. He had debts and a fragile, quiet life. He wasn't built for headlines or investigations. Yet the thought of walking away felt wrong in a way that made his stomach turn. Someone had left a message on that wall for whoever might come after. Don't wait. Don't keep silent. He wasn't sure he had the courage to follow that plea, but the alternative felt like complicity. He rose finally, placing the photo back among the scattered files, though his hand shook. His flashlight swept once more across the munitions crates, the crumbling papers, the toys abandoned by children who had once believed in this place could keep them safe. He felt small and unprepared, but also marked by what he now knew. Whatever this had been, a refuge, an arsenal, a hub of secret deals, it wasn't just a historical curiosity. It was dangerous. It was a wound left open. Daniel found the way back to the stairs slowly, his legs heavier than when he had descended. Each step upward rang in the hollow space like an accusation. By the time he reached the first hidden rooms with their shrouded furniture and dust-choked air, his shirt was damp with sweat despite the cold. He paused once, looking back toward the darkness he was leaving, but the black swallowed his light almost instantly. There were more corridors beyond what he had explored, more secrets in the maze beneath the mansion. But he couldn't go farther alone. Not now. It was enough to know that whatever had been built here hadn't died with the family who vanished. It was still here, sleeping but not harmless. When he emerged into the hallway above and pulled the concealed door shut behind him, the sound was long and scraping, echoing down the secret passage until it faded. Dust billowed out around him as he leaned against the cool wall, chest heaving. For a long time he just stood there, listening to the silence of the house reclaim itself. But it wasn't the same silence as before. It wasn't inert anymore. It was charged, aware, almost waiting. Daniel gathered his tools with mechanical motions, his mind too full to think clearly. As he walked through the empty foyer and out into the gray light of late afternoon, the mansion loomed behind him like a mute sentinel. He could feel the choice forming already, heavy and unavoidable. What he had found wasn't his to keep secret, and yet the thought of bringing it into the light filled him with dread. The simple painter's life he knew would end the moment he spoke. Driving home felt like moving through a fog. The streets of the town looked unchanged, but his vision of the world had shifted. He was no longer just a man prepping walls. He was the unwilling keeper of a dangerous history, one that could ignite again if left hidden. As the sun set behind him, Daniel understood that whatever peace he'd once had was gone. The house had shared its heart with him, and it demanded he decide what to do with its secrets. Night was long and cruel. Daniel lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of his small apartment, unable to untangle the thoughts knotted inside his skull. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the underground room, the rows of rusted bunks, the plates on the table left mid-meal, the scratched plea on the wall. He imagined children lying awake down there decades ago, hearing their father's footsteps above, waiting for news that never came. He imagined those same children grown and scattered, never able to speak of what they had seen. The house's silence felt different now. It was no longer empty. It was expectant. He tried to picture what would happen if he did nothing. Someone else would buy the mansion someday, perhaps a developer with fewer scruples, perhaps someone with an eye for salvage. The crates might be opened, their contents moved quietly into the world, sold, stolen, detonated by accident. He had no proof of what was inside, but his gut told him it was dangerous. He had seen enough sharp stenciled warnings and military codes to feel certain. And then there were the papers. Names, contracts, offshore accounts. This was not just history. It was a secret powerful people had buried, a secret they might still want buried. Fear kept him awake as much as conscience. He was a solitary man with little money, no allies, and a job that barely paid the bills. He imagined headlines, lawyers, accusations of trespassing or theft. He pictured men in suits arriving to reclaim whatever he had found. Men who might not care what happened to a nobody who scraped the wrong wall. Yet behind every fearful scenario came the image of that carved message. We are waiting. Waiting is worse than death. Someone had asked for this silence to end. And maybe, he thought bitterly, it had taken this long for a man too ordinary to matter to stumble upon it. By dawn, he hadn't slept at all. The gray light that crept through his blinds felt heavy, but it also brought a strange clarity. His life was already quiet to the point of invisibility. If he lost jobs, if his name ended up in a paper, so be it. But if he walked away and one day learned that weapons from that basement had resurfaced to harm someone, he wouldn't forgive himself. He dressed slowly, drank cold coffee from the night before, and sat at the table with his phone in his hand for a long time before dialing the non-emergency line for the local police. His voice was rough from exhaustion as he explained what he had found. He expected laughter or disbelief. Instead, there was a pause on the other end, followed by a careful series of questions. Address, access, safety hazards. The operator's tone changed when he mentioned military crates and chemical warnings. Within minutes, he was transferred to someone higher up who told him very calmly to stay where he was and wait for officers to arrive and escort him back to the site. Daniel hung up, feeling both relieved and newly terrified. Things had begun moving in a way he could no longer control. He spent the next hour pacing his apartment, staring out the window at the empty street. 2 police SUVs finally pulled up, lights off but presence unmistakable. The officers who stepped out were polite but tense, the kind of men used to situations that might turn dangerous. They asked him to lead them to the estate and followed in convoy as he drove. The house greeted them with the same brooding silence, but it felt somehow more watchful now that outsiders were arriving. Daniel unlocked the front door and let the officers sweep through the first rooms. They listened as he described the hidden door, the lever, the passage. When he pulled aside the temporary plastic sheeting he'd hung while working and revealed the scraped metal outline, their expressions changed from mild skepticism to sharp alertness. One tried the lever. The mechanism groaned obediently open. A cool draft swept out as though the house were sighing. More calls were made on radios. Soon the quiet driveway filled with vehicles, additional police, bomb squad trucks, a van marked with hazmat symbols, and eventually unmarked sedans with men and women in plain clothes who moved with practiced caution. Daniel stood back as the procession moved past him into the hidden passage. Flashlights cut through the gloom, voices echoed low and clipped. He was asked to remain upstairs while they secured the lower levels. The wait felt endless, but he caught fragments of radio chatter rising from below. Words like, munitions confirmed, unstable, call for disposal. His stomach sank with a mixture of vindication and dread. Hours passed. By afternoon, the estate looked like the site of a covert operation. Yellow caution tape fluttered across the front steps. Technicians in protective suits carried instruments and crates. Journalists had begun to gather behind hastily erected barriers, drawn by rumors and scanner traffic. Cameras flashed through the gates. Daniel watched from a shadowed corner of the foyer, unwilling to step into their line of sight. Eventually, one of the plainclothes officials approached him. The man's face was unreadable, but his tone was measured and respectful. He asked Daniel to recount, in detail, how he had discovered the hidden space. Daniel told the truth: the scraping, the hollow sound, the lever. He answered questions about whether he had moved or taken anything, whether anyone else knew. He was warned not to re-enter the restricted areas and not to discuss specifics with the press. They thanked him, but it felt more like a containment than gratitude. Still, no one threatened him. No one suggested he'd done wrong. In their calm, bureaucratic way, they seemed to recognize that he had done something necessary. By evening, the operation was still underway, but the mood had shifted. What had begun as a curious call had become a full-scale hazardous recovery. Trucks marked with military insignia arrived to handle the crates. Paper evidence was cataloged and sealed in waterproof containers. Someone told him quietly that historical crimes divisions and federal investigators would take over. Whatever network had existed around this mansion was long gone, but its remnants were now the government's problem, not his. Daniel stepped outside as dusk fell and stood just beyond the ring of lights and tape. The house was still there, dark against the deepening sky, but it looked somehow smaller now that its heart had been exposed. The silence no longer felt like a threat. It was simply the quiet of an old place, finally emptied of its ghosts. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that he had lost something precious. His anonymity had cracked. Neighbors might read his name tomorrow. Journalists might chase him for a comment. And even if they didn't, he would never again be just the man with a scraper and a paintbrush. He thought about the family in the photograph, the father shaking hands with soldiers, the children playing unaware of the arsenal beneath their feet. He thought about the words carved into the wall, about how long they had waited for someone to listen. Maybe that had been the real inheritance of the house. Not wealth, but a plea for truth, left to rot until a man desperate for rent money peeled away the years and heard it. Later that night, when he finally returned home, Daniel sank into a chair and let exhaustion roll over him. His phone buzzed with missed calls from numbers he didn't recognize. He ignored them. He turned on the news once, saw a grainy shot of the mansion swarmed with vehicles and floodlights, then switched it off. The story would belong to others, now journalists, officials, historians, eager to dig into the corruption of a long-dead tycoon. His part was done, though its cost was only beginning to tally in his chest. Sleep came slowly, but when it did, it was dreamless. For the first time since scraping that wall, he felt a strange quiet inside himself. Not peace, not exactly. There would be fallout to face, questions, and perhaps anger from those who wanted the secret kept buried. But there was no regret. He had done what the message on the wall demanded. He had refused to wait in silence. In the days that followed, news of the discovery spread. Articles painted him as a reluctant whistleblower, a working man whose careful eye had unearthed a forgotten weapons cache and a paper trail of illicit arms trading. Some headlines sensationalized, others simply reported. His name became briefly known in circles far beyond his small town. Work calls stopped for a while. Some clients canceled, afraid of reporters. But strangers also sent notes of thanks. A retired soldier wrote to tell him he had likely saved lives by bringing the cache to light. A historian emailed about the significance of the find. Daniel took it all quietly. He returned to smaller jobs eventually, though never with quite the same sense of anonymity. Sometimes he would pass by the gates of the mansion, now sealed and guarded, the house destined to become a historical site, or perhaps demolished. He would stop and look at it for a moment, remembering the smell of damp concrete, the toys in the dust, the desperate words carved into stone. Then he would drive on, because life had to go forward. He remained, at heart, a simple man with paint under his nails and calluses on his palms. But he had learned that even ordinary hands could uncover extraordinary truths. The house had kept its secret for half a century, waiting for someone with enough curiosity, and perhaps enough quiet courage, to break its silence. When Daniel Clark had arrived to do nothing more than scrape away old paint, he hadn't known he was about to change the story the house told about itself. Now he did. And though it had cost him comfort and obscurity, he would not undo it. Sometimes late at night, when the world outside his window was still, he thought again of that scrawled message. We are waiting. Waiting is worse than death. He hoped, wherever the souls who wrote it had gone, they could rest now. Their secret had been pulled into the light. The waiting was finally over. If you found this story compelling, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next hidden secrets we uncover. Click on the next video on your screen to keep exploring more untold stories waiting to be discovered. And share this video with friends and family. Some secrets are too powerful to stay buried.